Hi, and welcome back to the panel room. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight it is time to knock on the door of the speakeasy as we slip back into the 1920s. So before we get started, let's see who all is coming in to dress up and go for the party tonight. So, Dawn, you are up first.
Hi, my name is Dawn Dehel. I write under DS Dehel. I have published with both Ecstasy and Changeling books.
Jaym?
My name is Jaym Gates. I'm an author, editor, and game designer. My first 1920s project was actually the second anthology that I edited, which was a 1920s themed anthology.
Jess?
I'm Jessica Nettles. I am the author of Children of Menlo Park. And I just have a passion for the 1920s, even though my novel is not set there yet. My characters will eventually visit the 1920s, I have no doubt.
Leslye?
I'm Leslye Penelope. I write epic fantasy and fantasy romance. My latest novel is The Monsters We Defy, which takes place in 1925 in Washington, D.C. It's a historical fantasy based on some real characters and some real life people that you've heard of walk in and out of the novel as well.
Fraser?
I'm Fraser Sherman, Fraser. I publish under that name. I have a humorous story, The Woodhouse Murder Case, that takes place in a sort of roughly 1920s London. And I have a couple of projects I'm working on off and on that are also set in the decade at various points. But they're a long way from finishing.
Well, let's actually start on that idea of what attracts you to the 1920s. So we're basically 100 years on. We've got an interesting view of history from that period of time. So what is it specifically about the 1920s that draws you in from an interest, from a storytelling standpoint? What is it about that era that really calls to you? So Dawn, I'll start with you on that.
Well, I think I've been a fan of the 1920s probably since U.S. history, way back in ninth grade. Excuse me. And maybe because it was something new, because, in history, we always started out, with colonization, and you never got much past the Civil War. So that may have been part of it. But there's an exuberance to the 1920s. There is a joy, and it's a reactionary joy, and I know that. But there is sort of it's a very young decade, very focused on young people, which was a little different, and slightly lawless. And I think that all of those possibilities really attracted me.
Jaym?
I think a big part of it for me was that I discovered F. Scott Fitzgerald and some of the other 1920s authors, fairly early on. And so for me, it was kind of this fascinating, fantastical time where you really started to see a lot of kind of the roots of modern science fiction and fantasy. We have a lot of that adventure fiction that started coming in. But also, I think part of that's because it was a really transformative time. We still had frontiers that we didn't understand. Technology was just starting to really, really pick up and explode. So the entire world was changing dramatically. You were getting big bursts of cultural mixing that you hadn't really had before, and starting the beginning of globalism. So, I love the physical manifestations of that, the fashion, all of the things that we think of when we think of the Roaring '20s. But I also love a lot of the background causes and the fallout results of that moving forward.
Yes?
For me, there's like this crossing for me. So part of it is I was drawn in by the movies and the fashion. I'm a big old movie fan. So seeing the movies from that era early on just really made me go, oh, look at all those dresses. I grew up thinking maybe one day I'll get to dress like that. No, but still. And also reading science fiction and fantasy from that era, Burroughs and things like that. And just once again, the exuberance and the hey, let's try this comes from that period. And of course, as I got older and began reading literature and becoming a literature major, you encounter Fitzgerald and the glamour from that. And so all of that kind of draws me in, and it never gets old for me. I'm always looking again and going, wow, just look at those dresses, or wow, look at that attitude, and that history, and look at what we were exploring at that time. It's very interesting.
Leslye?
For me, the story came first. I didn't know that I liked the 1920s. I mean, I did set my original fantasy series, like Second World Fantasy, in an alternate version of the 20s for technological reasons. Like I wanted cars and guns and telephones. I didn't want to do something that was pre all of that. But for the latest book, The Monsters We Defy, I knew that I wanted to tell a story that took place during the Harlem Renaissance. And just because that period was just culturally so impactful. And also you have kind of the changing of technology, the emergence of what we consider, I guess, sort of modernity. But it was in research on, okay, what aspect of the Harlem Renaissance did I want to focus on? And that's when I found, the perfect year being 1925 for the story that I was telling. And then after that, I started doing more research and fell in love with a lot of the things that I learned about. And so it was kind of like the opposite from a lot of the other authors here, in that it was all story based. And I do hope to return there one day, but I'm not sure when.
Fraser?
The two things that appeal to me, one is that it's, as James said, transformative. Movies have become huge, but vaudeville is still around. Radio is big, but people are still sending lots of messages and communication by telegram. We're transitioning between technology. Cars are big, but getting from one coast to the other would be a Herculean effort because the highway system wasn't there yet. The other, and I can't say exactly appeals to me, but the aftermath of the Great War was huge. It was big, it was technological, it was brutal. There were people who came home traumatized. There were people who came home thinking it was the biggest, most exciting thing they'd ever done. And while we can look back now and see how the end of World War I lay the seeds for World War II, if you're in the 20s, it still looked like it could have been the war to end all wars, and the League of Nations would hold, and the military-industrial complex would not become a thing the way it did. And that's I wish that had worked out. So those would be the two key things for me.
Well, let's actually start talking about kind of the social movements of the 20s, because again, I think this is where a lot of it falls, because everything that we see, the exuberance, the celebratory mood, there's a lot of things that come out that are really interesting out of that started in the late teens, but really took hold in the 20s. We see the jazz movement, we see spiritualist movements, we see a lot of movement away from quote unquote conventional approaches. We see some of the early days of, social movements and civil rights and suffrage movements and all these things that are going on. And the music and the culture really reflected that energy and that sense of change, as well as kind of a collective trauma from plague, from World War I. A lot of things, almost like the Party to Survive, have survived the teens. So, Jaym, what are the things that culturally from that period of time, speak to you? What are the things that you would like to play with, or that really have importance for you?
A big one for me is, like I mentioned early on, the cultural mixing. People are starting to, the boundaries of that, this is who I am. I am from this country, the city in this country that is everything that I am. My partner is probably from there. My parents have been from there. In the Americas, that had always been a little more nebulous, but you started to see it a lot more. Okay, well, I'm from here, but I live here now. I've adopted this. This has become part of my makeup. And you start to see new cultures sort of building out of that, whether that was lifestyle cultures. Someone else mentioned you started to see a little bit more queer awareness. And a little bit more of that community coming in. So you started to have the ability to create your own found sort of home which I think there's a lot of parallel with now, where we're really starting to lean into that creating your own environment. So, and that's just one of the many ways that I think that the 20s really echo a lot of what we're dealing with now, in many, many ways, not least of which is some of the issues around, societal health. We're dealing with obvious similarities now, but it's really fascinating to me how those things overlap and how that culture is echoed today. So kind of playing with that, whether that's, bringing that forward so that people are seeing those comparisons, or just playing more with it in that time and looking more at some of those sociological elements is a big thing for me.
Jess?
Well, I'm really moved by the expat movement literally. And so you have these people that, like she said, moved from their comfort zones to different places. They were moving from the United States to Europe, where it was easier to do the things she was talking about, being who they were, discovering who they were. And especially like for women, having their voices heard as women, especially in the writing community, was a big deal. Because even up until, the late 1800s, a woman writer, it was pretty hard to get out there. It was pretty hard to be accepted as a female writer. But during this period, suddenly you're able to write under your own name. Holy cow. You're able to produce things on your own without having to do this through a man. That's amazing. It's a powerful thing. So suddenly women have voices, and they have political voice, they have literary voice, and they have the ability to push on things like they've never been able to before. It's so awesome. And that's something that I think sets the stage for a whole lot of things that are to come in the 30s and the 40s, and also set the stage for civil rights, not just for women, but for other people as well. And I think that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, in fact, I just recently had a story come out that is set. Part of it is set in the 20s with all the the author movement. Hemingway comes through a piece of it. The lost generation that was seen and named from that period of time. So I actually just pulled some of that into a story that just came out.
How about you?
How about you, Leslye? What are some of the the cultural elements for that period that speak to you?
Yeah, there was so much. I mean, the time period, for Black America, we're in Jim Crow, and it's so there's segregation. But what I wanted to write about, my story takes place in DC, so I'm focused very, very much on DC, a little bit on the Great Migration of former the enslaved people and their children coming up from the South into the North, and that's a big part of it too. But creating communities. So during segregation, Black people had to rely on themselves, and they had these self-sufficient communities where you could be employed, you could shop, you could do your grocery shopping, go to Black-owned movie theaters, Black-owned stores. And, they had this self-contained existence that I really wanted to focus on, not so much the racial strife that was also going on, because I did place my story in 1925 because that was the year. It's, the resurgence of the Klan happens in like 1915, but in 1925, the Klan marches down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House in DC. And that's just a tiny part of the story, but it's the reality that my characters are living under, where this is this oppressive environment, but there's also the jazz and the literature and all of the Harlem Renaissance happening. And people are living their, beautiful, wonderful lives amidst this great oppressive system, and trying to just eke out these existences and find joy and create great art and, try to find freedom. They're petitioning, they're trying to have the anti-lynching bill, which never passed in this country, to get some justice for the lynching that was happening and all of the terrors and the horrors. But at the same time, they're creating great beauty. And so there's, like Jessica was saying, there's lots of women artists and writers. I talk about the Saturday Nighters, which was a group that met on Saturday nights in a woman's house in Washington, D.C. full of every Harlem Renaissance author you've ever heard of. Langston Hughes was there, Jean Toomer. I mean, and plus a lot of women like Jessie Fauset, and women were publishing plays and books and poetry. And the Saturday Nighters was largely made up of women writers, according to my research. So yeah, we know about, jazz and a lot of the other kind of forward-facing, things that we can listen to now. But there was just so much joy and beauty happening amidst all of the sorrow and the pain. And that's kind of what I wanted to write about during this time period.
Fraser?
The Woodhouse murder case is set. My protagonist is a wizard, but he also writes mystery stories. And this is set during as they now call it, the golden age of detective fiction, when Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and a lot less well-remembered writers were going on. And even though those books have their flaws by today's standard, I have read a lot of them and movies based on them. And it is really fun to play with the cliches because my protagonist gets caught up in a murder mystery that's modeled on all the books at an old country house where people are dropping like flies and there's a fog moving in and they can't get out and the killer is among them. And I had a hoot with that one. Otherwise, to name an ugly movement, which the project I'm still working on, this was an era when anti-immigration really got going. America in the 19th century had opposition, and then the first anti-immigration laws were passed dealing with Asians. But in the 1920s, we were seeing more European immigration from Eastern Europe, Italy, people who were not WASPs. And it was getting increasingly oppositional. There were intelligence tests heavily rigged to American culture to disqualify the unfit and keep them out. Eugenics was becoming a thing. And while this is not a good social movement, it is one that I would like to deal with because it's fascinating. I will make a recommendation. Molly Tanzer's Creatures of Wanton Ruin is set in the 1920s and has appropriately a Lovecraftian cult that is also active in anti-immigration politics. That's perfect.
Dawn?
I don't think I'm very different from just about anybody else. The 1920s was about building a new world, I think. And I really liked playing with these ideas. Everything had been fractured and there was a lot of ugliness, but so much came out of it, like the rise of the middle class in America through the stock market, which of course led to the 1930s. But there is a little bit more equality, I think, not just for women, but, for middle class and Midwesterners and this whole sort of go movement. And I think that was something I like to play with. I do have one story set in the 1920s, and that's all part of it. But one of the main characters is death because he's just tired after the First World War. And so, I think that all of it coming together is in this massive cultural outburst that I really think there's a lot of potential there for writers that we can build on.
Well, and I think one of the things that we saw a lot come out of the period were the dichotomies, because we saw this great movement from rural areas into the cities. Much of what we perceive and remember about the 20s is stuff from the metro areas. We don't look at much of the Dust Bowl era. We don't look at much of the small towns because people were moving to the cities. And so we don't really see that much of the culture from those periods, and how sometimes some of the anti-lynching movements, how some of the musical movements and things like that stirred the life and the change in cities. And I think one of the things that is still glamorized very much in that period of time is how crime was balanced. We all know about the gangster era. We've seen all the Capones. And, you see Al Capone running the speakeasies and making the money, but at the same time also supporting the soup lines and the bread lines. You see a lot of other players coming in with these definitive dichotomies that you looked at that defined not quite a Wild West culture, because, again, there was a lot of metropolitan to it, but you see the music and the energy and all these sorts of things. When we look at at a lot of the literary elements from that period of time. We look at the F. Scott Fitzgerald, and the story's written primarily about wealth and movement versus we look at, Hemingway, survivors from the war. We look at all these players. Are there specific literary influences you like or resonate with from that period of time? I mean, obviously, this is also in the middle of, Lovecraft developing his stories. We see a lot of the foundations in modern horror and science fiction coming out of this period that's written about trying to understand this technological and societal revolution. So, Jess, how about you? Are there specific kind of literary influences, stories, things like that either influence you, you've drawn on, or just draw you back to those tales from that period of time?
I have. There's several different authors and styles that I'm drawn to. I'm drawn to the science fiction and fantasy, like Burroughs, Lovecraft, because those are the roots. Those are the roots of what we do. So, there's that exploration of, what kind of scientific things are we doing next? The flying cars and that kind of thing. But we have to be careful while we're exploring those things, because once again, there's a dichotomy. There's all this wonder and, all this crazy stuff that we want to explore, but there's also this ugly undertone and undercurrent of things in Burroughs and in Lovecraft with the racism that goes on in both of them. And so we have to be careful as we're mining and going through and learning our roots. What part of the roots do we want to abandon and we don't want to follow? The other influences are things like Agatha Christie. I was flipping around over here thinking about Jeeves and Wooster earlier, P.G. Wodehouse. And, once again, we talk about as the discussion of class as much as it is the learning how to build a mystery. I learned how to build mysteries by reading Christie. I've been reading Christie since I was 11. She's a huge influence. That locked door, that locked mystery room where everybody's there, including the killer, and you've got to figure out who it is. I love that. I still love that. And I love the style behind it. And I love the fashion and Poirot and all of that. And once again, you have to navigate through her classism too, because there's that, while she's doing all of this wonderful stuff, she's also looking down on, the staff in the house. She's looking down on the people of color in the room. And they're not as good. And so we have to be careful as we navigate and we learn from these people to learn the right things and learn to distinguish when they're doing something that maybe we don't want to repeat.
Leslye?
I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, absolutely you are.
Yeah, there's a name somebody quoted. It's okay. I think it was, I forget who, but it's okay to look back, but just don't stare, which sort of sums up, look back, take from it, but don't obsess over all of it.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I do think that, things are being taken out of canon now, and I'm ambivalent about that. I think it's perfectly possible to read something and understand that it's a product of the time, and that person has views that we don't agree with, but I don't necessarily know that we need to stop reading all of these things. But, for me, literary influences, Langston Hughes was always someone that I really loved reading, and I actually have him as a minor character in the novel, a young Langston Hughes who lived in Washington D.C. at the time. And also, there's a history of African Americans writing speculative fiction going back to the 1800s. In 1920, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a short story called The Comet, which is this post-apocalyptic fiction that, when I found it, I was like, I didn't expect him to have written anything like this. And there's other examples that I think are really interesting, but specifically from the 20s, also just other writers who would come through DC or who were from there and writing about DC, because I was just really immersed. So someone like Jean Toomer, whose book Kane was, I think, in 1925, just a very strange, like experimental novel that is part poetry and vignettes and all kinds of different things combined together. I've always loved Zora Neale Hurston as a writer who, not necessarily DC, but just in that time period, such a huge Harlem Renaissance figure. And then also even in nonfiction, like Elaine Locke, who in 1925 wrote a book called The New Negro, which was very influential to the people in the Harlem Renaissance. And they're always like talking about dichotomies. There's sort of in the Black community that this tension between different ideas of how to move forward. You know, your Booker T versus WEB, which is more like, oh, how do we progress? Do we, try to agitate and fight, or do we try to just work within the system and make changes from within as much as possible? And that tension works in the literary community and the musical community. It was evident everywhere. And so those kinds of things, it's part of the time of transformation. People are having these conversations, these debates throughout history. But I think in the 20s, it was really firing up, and you could see people trying to figure out, okay, this is where we've been, and we've made a lot of strides, post Civil War. How do we get to where we want to be? And that's, 100 years later, we're still asking those questions and trying to answer some of the same questions, unfortunately, with as much progress as has obviously been made, but the parallels that I was seeing between 1925 and 2020 when I was writing it, were just kind of amazing to me also.
Fraser?
I'm going to name, in addition to Burroughs and Lovecraft, two people I wish I could had influenced me, but I can't quite master the stuff I like in them. A. Merritt was one of the great science fantasy writers. Books like Face in the Abyss, Dweller in the Mirage. They look like fantasy, but they're all rationalized with what passed for science more or less at the time, other dimensional entities, racial memory handed down, things like that. And it gives it a very wonderfully exotic, strange flavor to me now that I would like to capture in my own work, but my style does not fit. And then Johnston McCullers wrote The Mark of Zorro, the original Zorro novel. And it is a wonderful, delightful book. And he has this great romantic line at the climax where Zorro and the woman he loves are surrounded. And Zorro says, well, it looks like we're not going to make it out. And she looks up at him, then show me your face and kiss me, and then I can die. And I would love to say something that melodramatic and romantic in my own work, but again, I don't quite have the knack. But I would recommend A. Merritt or Mark of Zorro to anyone who likes that kind of fiction.
Dawn?
I can actually point to two very specific. One is Zora Neale Hurston and her short story Spunk. It's got this lovely ambiguity about horror, and that I really appreciate. And she always has a very clear voice. The second is an author with another real clear voice, is Dorothy Parker. Her attitude toward life and everything has fascinated me since the first time I picked up her poetry. And her short story, The Waltz, is a story that I've come back to again and again. And it's this internal monologue. And it was in the back of my head when I started courting death. And the first time my editor read it, she told me I had to rewrite. She said, no, this is just too modern. And I actually sent her a copy of The Waltz and said, no, this is I'm channeling Dorothy Parker here. And she accepted it as it was. I think she had in her head that the 20s female was just much more reserved than this, I don't know who this guy is. I don't want to dance with him. Oh my gosh, to get me out of here kind of person. And those are just two really huge influences. And I think I kind of channel Parker most days anyway. So that's where I come from.
Jaym?
So I'm glad someone mentioned Zorro, because being from California, there was no way that I was going to get through reading as a kid and not run into Zorro a lot. I especially love that one because it was a really good critique, and even in Pulp Fiction, of some of the injustices and inequalities going on, in the foundation of that state. I also have had the privilege of working on some Robert E. Howard works, and for me, that's another one who's a really interesting example of kind of the changing awarenesses of that era, because you can, if you read chronologically through his work, you can see him starting to question some of those beliefs and starting to become a little bit more aware of himself and of the world around him. Someone whom I love is Clark Ashton Smith. He was a contemporary of Lovecraft who basically delighted in calling Lovecraft an idiot. Like they had a very vibrant correspondence, and he just was like, "You are a backwater prejudiced idiot, buddy," and he called that out a lot. And it was really fun because I discovered him in my early 20s, and he actually wrote about my hometown. Like there were buildings in his stories that I have been in as a kid, just growing up, and ranches that he talked about that are still there. So that was really, really big for me, was kind of discovering that the area I grew up in had that weird background. And the weird has been a huge influence for me because of where I grew up. So kind of seeing that was this unintentional homage to that was really cool for me. And I've been really lucky because I got to write for the Zorro tabletop RPG, which was a huge honor. I've gotten to edit Robert E. Howard works. And so in my own writing, a lot of that comes through as well, but it's really fun to go back and be able to write to those things that did influence me so strongly and to be able to contribute to their modern reinterpretations, or even just, redressings, essentially, and creating something that's a little bit more thoughtful now.
When I look at the 20s, I mean, there's really one thing that I cannot not think about, and that is the music. I'm a big fan of jazz, as you might can tell. But there's such an energy and a hopefulness, and it's almost a soundtrack for change and for experimentation. And you have so many flavors within the music, and you go through and you see the speakeasy era, which is again the product of Prohibition, and you see the quote unquote average law-abiding citizen. And again, I think this is largely seen in more the metro areas and things like that, the larger cities. But you see this idea where the music is both fueling the change, and it's fueling the era as well as being a product of the era. So Leslye, have you played with the music any? Does it factor into the stuff that you're writing, that you're doing? Any thoughts of the music of the period?
Definitely. Yeah, it absolutely factors in. I discovered in my research, and something I don't think that I knew, even though I'm from the DC area, U Street in DC was called Black Broadway around this time because it had so many nightclubs. It also had theater, both like motion picture and live theater, vaudeville. And so many people would come through, like so many stars would come through U Street and this Black Broadway. And so music was incredibly important to the very specific neighborhood that I found myself writing about. And, Duke Ellington is from Washington, D.C. By the time that I was writing, he had moved to New York, but I read his whole autobiography, which is very crazy and, and a very strange audio. It's hard to find. I had to buy it from a used bookstore. And, he's not a writer. I don't think he even had a ghostwriter. It doesn't feel like it. He was just like recollections of random encounters and things maybe he shouldn't have written down. But, trying to get in the mind of a musician and what it was like. And, it was difficult to make a living, but they were playing all kinds of things. Like Duke Ellington would, loved jazz, but he would go to some, rich person's party and play that kind of music. And then the next night he'd be in a speakeasy and just playing a totally different kind of music. And so they were versatile. They were just trying to make enough money to make ends meet. And yeah, that kind of thing. Like I knew I wanted a character who represented that lifestyle, who was a jazz musician and who kind of had that background about like, they're just going to play whatever they have to play until they can make it vaudeville also kind of came into the story, and what that was like. That kind of music was different tradition, and it had different roots, but it was all in the mix. I mean, the average person wasn't super discerning, I guess. Like, they would go to see whatever was playing, and at least the communities that I was writing about. And so yeah, the life of music and the musicians and sort of the nightlife was incredibly important into bringing the time period alive, and just making it feel vibrant and like it was lived in, and all of that. I had a lot of fun researching all of these figures and trying to imagine like what the life of a musician in 1925 would have been like, and how degenerate I needed to get into to bringing them to life.
Did you play with the blues side of it as well? Because that's one of those things that, to me, is when I look at the music of the period, it's the balance of Delta blues and Robert Johnson and all those influences and against jazz. I mean, I love both of them, and you can see the fight between them.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That was an influence too.
How about you, Fraser?
I do not have a strong feel for music of any era, so I don't think what does interest me. This was still an era when a lot of people would be singing at home. Sheet music was a really huge moneymaker in the music industry because people would take it and play or sing. And the long playing record did not exist yet. All you had were the short 45s with maybe one song and the B-side. And that is something I would like to incorporate, simply because it is so different from the way we have consumed music for all of my life. And that stuff always intrigues me.
Dawn?
The music comes in sort of backwards, because for me it's about dance, and they go hand in hand, quite obviously. And of course, everybody thinks of the Charleston, which is an incredibly fun dance to do, but there's also the Lindy, which is super hard. We get the beginnings of swing dance, towards the end of the era, but these all coming together because the skirts get shorter, so you can do these dances. And you also start seeing the Latin influence. The tango comes in, and you start getting these super sexy dances as well. So not as in front, as Leslye, but definitely so in the back way, because I like to talk about the connections you have to make to do this kind of dancing.
Jaym?
Yeah, I don't have as much of a experience with 1920s music as with some other eras, but it is something that I love a lot of, kind of the blend where you were getting still classical, still more folk elements, but starting to really bring in, as was mentioned, some of those other cultural influences into the American mainstream, starting to really see some influence from Black musicians, even some Mexican, especially once you get into the California area. And just the sense of grandeur about it, it's a little bit bombastic in a lot of ways. And it feels a little bit more freeform than the music that came before it, which was often very much about those, more conservative dances, the things that were acceptable for the high society ladies to gather around and enjoy, things that didn't really, foster a sense of licentiousness or sexiness, as was mentioned. But you start really getting a lot of emotion, a lot of even some anger into some of the music that I think you were missing before. And it really transformed a lot of things. And there are a lot of different sort of micro musical, I don't want to say cultures, but sort of pools that developed around that time that were really interesting.
Now, being somebody who I've worked in tech and technology my entire life, my entire career, and as writers, we often joke that, had they had cell phones on Buffy, the episodes would have lasted 3 minutes. When we look at the technology of the 20s, you're looking at this explosion where, 10 years before, 15 years before, you still had horses and carriages predominantly going through every city in the world. This is where you're now seeing the early stages, really, of at least within cities, automotives. You see cars running around. You're getting into early stage commercial aviation. People are able to move around. You've got communication because while you've had telegraph lines, phone lines are becoming more prevalent, and then especially in the cities, you're seeing more and more phone and phone communication. We see this just explosion in technologies. Again, things like radio, things like record players. We're seeing these technologies where there's a foundation that is everything we deal with and look at in the modern life today. So, Fraser, from your side of things, when you look at them, what are the technologies that you love to play with about the 20s? And are there any limitations you run into because of something that either is or isn't created by that point in time in terms of the story?
I think I love radio and I love the telegraph just because it was still so important back then, and getting a telegram was such a big deal, and it was such a powerful method of communication when it was introduced. I love the fact that most phones, you are still going to go to a switchboard and a switchboard operator, and sometimes you'd have two or three, if you're out in a rural area, 2 or 3 people on one line. And I have not played with that, but that is something I would love to work with. And there is no technology a lot of the military technology that came in is kind of during World War I, poison gas, better guns, better shells, kind of horrifying, but certainly an effective thing to play with. And of course, cars, the big game changer for so many people. You could get out of the house, you could go somewhere private, you could make out in a car. So all of that fascinates me. There's nothing that particularly stands out, and whatever makes it into my stories is whatever feels right at the time. Story first and then tech second.
Dawn, how about you?
For me, the tech was a little more of like walls that you run into, because you tend to think of you just have a character do something and I'd have to stop and go, wait, was that even possible? And then, Google it. It was set in New York, and I had to keep saying, well, can they walk this way? Just that kind, so much has changed. One of the strange things that I had, it was another debate with my editor, had to do with a clock that had like illuminated hands, like radium hands. And it was a 2-sentence thing. He looks over at the clock, and she said he couldn't have seen it in the dark. And I was like, no, he could. Those are radium girls. And then, this whole other conversation. And so I think for me, technology of the era tends to be rabbit holes I fall down. Because I just get really fascinated, and because we think that it was like sort of a barren era, like, oh, they didn't have cell phones, there must be nothing, but in fact there was quite a lot, that they had technologically, and I spend hours just watching movies and things like that.
How about you, Jaym? What's the tech you love to play with?
I mean, this was the era where we started to really be able to share art, in all of its forms. The radio, the movies, even the phone lines. You could start talking to people about things that were coming out or that were being seen. You started having more storytellers, women able to tell those stories. You started really getting away from it just being the upper class cis white male dominated art scene. And it was still a struggle for pretty much anyone else to actually have any sort of impact or reach in, the mainstream. But again, because you had those cultures developing, you had more spaces that those could spread. And especially once you started having movies where people on opposite sides of the country could see the same thing and talk about it. It was still pretty slow and not flexible by our standards. But by that standard, the standard at that time, that was pretty amazing. So I love how that started to kind of transform the artscape of, how we create things, why we create them, and how we share them.
So since we're talking art scene, what's your thoughts on Art Deco and the Egyptian movement of the period?
Who's that one going to?
I'm going to throw that to you since we started on architecture.
So it's one of those things that, so I was really lucky a few years ago, and I was in Germany, and I got to go and see one of the world's biggest exhibits on the art, on that era's obsession with the Egyptian everything. And I mean, it wasn't as creepy as the Victorians. Like, at least to my knowledge, they weren't eating the mummies, which, no. But it was a really interesting sense of like this intersection between cultural appropriation and the fact that they just had access to something so new and so exciting. Like, this is something that we can enjoy and bring in that isn't what we're used to. And I kind of think that it may have paved the way a little bit for having more expression across different cultures and kind of bringing in some of those mingled elements. I mean, there are some absolutely amazing jewelers and costume designers that we still know of today who pulled from that. But there wasn't a lot of awareness of where that appropriation line was being crossed a lot of the time. And that, like I said, that exhibit was amazing, but so much of that stuff was looted. It was stolen. It was, that was an era where we really started seeing a lot of things just disappearing from the public eye because they were going to private collectors. They were being locked away in museums. So it's a really mixed bag of aesthetically, I appreciate it. I love it. There are some absolutely magnificent expressions of art from that time, but it also was hugely problematic and laid a foundation for a lot of problems, that we're still dealing with today.
That is something I do love about the period and would like to incorporate into a story at some point. They still had art movements, surrealism, futurism, and they believed these were significant. They could change society. They could change art. Nobody does that anymore. Nobody cares enough to do that. And I don't think you could get a body of artists together to try something like that. And reading about the surrealists, the futurists, it's fascinating and it's fun. And I would like to do something with that.
So how about you, Jess? What are your thoughts on the tech of the period, especially with Menlo Park?
I've been thinking about it while everybody was talking because my book happens in the 1880s. But my plan is to move my characters forward through time because they can do that. I really want to see the Brotherhood use cars. I can't wait to see them use cars. I think that would be so cool. Because right now we're still using horses and we're using like airships and things like that. I play around with technology a little bit and take liberties. But I think cars would be very interesting. And the whole, how far can I take the telephone in my timeline, because my timeline's a little different than everybody else's. So, what can I do to tinker with it? And, what can I do with it to bring it forward into the 20s and still make it relevant and make it, connected to the 20s, but also maybe tinker with it a little bit and make it connected to what my timeline is doing too. And also, I'm real interested in radio and the entertainment side of things too. The idea of my characters seeing, a movie for the first time. What would that be like? Fun things like that. And tinkering around with things just to see what happens.
Leslye, what's your thoughts on the tech of the period?
So my undergraduate degree is in film production. And when I was first thinking about this, I was thinking I was going to do something with film, and I was looking at the different, filmmakers of the time, early filmmakers, the talkies, the first talkies, 27, right? And just that was just a huge step forward in terms of entertainment across the board. And I've always been fascinated by early film, and then, the addition of the sound and the culture around watching movies and all of that stuff. So I didn't include it in this book, but it is something that I still have this idea of how do I mix a magic system with like early films, and something's cooking in the back of my mind. I don't know. And then I'm always also fascinated with telegraphs, like Fraser said. I've, growing up watching old movies, seeing someone come and deliver a telegram to you. Like I always wanted
So
to have a telegram.
romantic.
Yeah, doesn't it? It
So
seems
romantic.
Like the thing. Email is just not the same. Like I want a messenger with a hat on to come to my house with a little envelope and a telegram. So I had a lot of fun with there's one or two telegrams in the book, but like any book I can put a telegram in, I'm happy to do so.
So I'm going to throw one last kind of question out there from a thought perspective. When we look at the era of the 20s, there's still a tremendous amount of influence from that period on material we're producing today. I mean, obviously, we're about to see Indiana Jones number 804. We see a lot of stories that are set in the period, but we also see a lot of things, I think, that just echo the period. So are there things that we're seeing in modern day today that really are echoes back to that period of the 20s? And are you consciously, or maybe even not even consciously, allowing that to influence how you're looking at stories set in the modern period? So who wants to take that one first? I can hum the Jeopardy theme.
I don't mind taking that one. I mean, we're seeing a huge resurgence in the interest in like the jewelry and the fashion of that era. Especially now that I think there's a can of worms I am not going to open up, but something that I am noticing because I've been paying a lot of attention to the AI art space is that there's a lot of resurging interest in a lot of those forms coming out of that space, which I think will be interesting because we have kind of gone through, I think it was Fraser who said that, for a while we didn't really have movements in art. I'm wondering if we're going to start seeing some more of that because there is more of that communal element coming back in where people can go, well, I am a person who really likes this thing, and I'm finding my people who do. There's a lot of the forecasting is that maximalism is going to become a trend again. That's a very 1920s sort of theme. The big colors, the big patterns, lots of patterns and beauty and elegance and ornate design, which often does follow a period of, a lot of societal upheaval. So I really want to see if we're going to start seeing a lot of physical representation of that. But we also have storytellers like Guillermo del Toro, who is hugely influenced by a lot of the 1920s storytellers and has been bringing that into some of his work. We do see it in fiction. We've had a lot of great fiction authors who've dealt with that time period in science fiction and fantasy recently. I think that's going to continue to be a strong thing too.
Well, and I'd actually argue, and I think I did this on a podcast not long ago, that a lot of the AI created art is driven by surrealism. A lot of what we see as the basis that is based on surrealist works from the period that are public domain. And so I think that's where we see some of that influence directly in some of the toys and platforms that I'm playing with. So yeah, I would agree with that entirely.
I think in some ways that what we're seeing now is like an echo of an echo, because the 80s was definitely influenced by the 20s. I mean, I remember wearing drop-waisted dresses and a lot of the forms were there. And there's this, I was teaching recently and the kids are just fascinated with the 80s. Well, you can't look at the 80s and not see the 20s. And so I think that all of these are kind of coming, we're seeing just reverberations, over time. And also I think of Netflix and this serial, because basically a series is just serial. And that was just hugely popular in the late 20s in the movies, like you said, with Indiana Jones. And so I think that we're seeing that as well, this fascination with cliffhangers and action movies. We see that in our superheroes as well. And so they're kind of all coming together.
Yeah, because Buck Rogers came out during that period of time.
Right.
That was the kickoff of that in the serials and the sci-fi serials.
I would also say there's a resurgence in the type of mysteries, once again, like the Agatha Christie style of mystery we see Glass Onion and Knives Out, where you have the great detective in a locked area where he or she is solving a mystery, and you have this great cast around him or around her. Somebody's dead, and that's definitely rooted in that period. So, and people are going crazy over it, and I'm like, well, we've seen this over and over again, but okay, and it's still good.
And it's talking about some of the same things in terms of class.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also horror, like with the pulp magazines from the 20s. We're seeing there's a lot of horror. I think partially in terms of film, it's relatively inexpensive to make, but it makes a lot of money. But there's also those metaphors that, horror writers have always been dealing with. We're dealing with in the 20s. I think the metaphors are different now, but it just represents where we are right now. And then one thing I wish would be a thing is diesel punk. Like, I think diesel punk is really great. I wish it was more popular and more prevalent. And
absolutely.
Yeah, I think
that's so much fun.
Fraser?
I honestly have nothing to say on this particular question. Sorry.
All right. So before we wrap things up, does anybody have any last thoughts?
A lot of people will freak out if you have somebody. There's an assumption I see in a lot of criticism online that if you have somebody who is pro-civil rights, pro-feminist, or generally is not a raging misogynist bigot, and they're set prior to the 1950s or 1960s, that is just transposing modern woke attitudes into the past. That is bollocks. People have believed, as you were pointing out earlier, people have been pro-equality pretty much in any era of the last century, and it's not at all anachronistic. It may express itself differently. The issues are going to be different, but those attitudes are there. So it is perfectly legit to put them in and have your protagonists not be bigots or misogynists.
And I think there's a lot of untapped and unmined stories from the 20s. I know when I was working on, my book, people are like, oh, the Roaring 20s, the Jazz Age. And I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't actually think of that because I was focused on a totally other part of the decade and other stories that I hadn't seen. So there's all kinds of stories from all, like, talking about rural and the country when everyone's leaving for the city. And, there's plenty of all the change was happening all around, and exploring different sides of that we haven't seen before. Maybe not in a speakeasy, not with gangsters. What else was happening? What did that lead to in places where that wasn't the culture? There's so many stories that could be told because this time is just so fertile.
Anybody else?
I think one of the best books of this era that one of the best authors, I should say, from around this general era is Robert Jackson Bennett. I just blanked on his name for a minute.
Yes.
Because I think he really shows what can be done with this era in terms of it not just being the sexy jazzy sort of thing, but digging into the sheer terror of what your world is changing massively. In a lot of ways, he took kind of the ideas of that Lovecraft had played so poorly with and explored them brilliantly in an Americana sort of sense. And that's, we don't really have a lot of really good Americana authors who treat our history kind of, this country's history kind of like a mythology. And I love that he did that. So that was one of the reading some of his stuff was what really gave me an appreciation for the complexity that you can get out of just this short little 10-ish year span of time. So I highly recommend reading him. And also, there definitely needs to be more diesel punk. So, I am 1000% there with you on that.
Dawn? Jess?
Everybody said everything I think of.
Yeah, I think everybody's hit it.
Well, guys, I appreciate you coming in so we could have fun with the 20s. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. And of course, those 20 themed stories that you've got going on and whatever other new releases are happening around. So Dawn, how about you go first?
So you can find links to all of my social media, and I'm on all of them to varying degrees, at dsdehel.com, and it's Dehel. That's where you can find me. My 1920s themed novella is called Courting Death, and it's set in 1926. And I have just started work on one that's also set around the same time, because there's been a call for Route 66, and I didn't know Route 66 started in Chicago until 2 days ago, and so the 20s are calling me back.
Jaym?
So primarily just jaymgates.com for me, and for the 1920s, there's a little anthology called Broken Time Blues. It contains a story by Robert Jackson Bennett, but also a bunch of other really lovely stories that examine everything from kind of the cultural and crime elements of the time to what it was, the fantastic queerness of the time as well. And it's an older anthology. It was the second one that I did, but it was kind of my love letter to the time.
Jess?
You can find me at jessicannettlesauthor.com. You can also find me on most social media, including Mastodon now. I have a few things coming out, none of which are 1920s centric, but I do have a few stories coming out later this year. You'll hear more about them on my social media as they come up during the year. Come see me.
Leslye?
My website is lpenelope.com, and you can find links to everything there, including my newsletter. And my novel is The Monsters We Defy. It takes place 1925 DC. Also, my original series, Ersinger Chronicles, completed fantasy series, which takes place in an alternate 1920s. And there are diesel punk aspects to it that I included. So check that out too.
And Fraser?
You can find me at frasersherman.com, Fraser. My 1920s set Woodhouse murder case is in my self-published anthology Atlas Shagged. You can find links on my website or just go to Amazon.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host tonight, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, thespeculative-fiction-academy.com, creatingprose.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we will see everybody again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.